Somewhere in the range of 12 to 15 million human beings were successfully carried across the Atlantic from Africa, landing in the Americas. Another 1.2 to 3 million are thought to have died along the way. Many more died inland in Africa in their post-capture transportation to the ships at the coast. Not counting those who would have died prior to capture in battles and whatnot. All told, though all these numbers are debated some 24 to 30 million Africans saw their death or enslavement thanks to this trade between mostly West Coast Africans and the Spanish, Portuguese, French, Dutch, and British lands at the other end. Our story starts before Columbus sailed across the sea, connecting the world zone sustainably for the first time. Even before Europeans began to topple empires and colonize the Americas, Portugal had, in the 1440s, started receiving their first ships of African slaves. Once Columbus established a connection, the slave trade extended to the New World, but not in any serious way until the 1510 authorization by King Ferdinand of slave shipments to the Caribbeans. Trickling upward still, it finally surpassed the numbers of African slaves being imported into Europe, overwhelmingly Portugal, after 1550. The numbers increased aggressively with the rising of sugar plantations along with the post-1700 gold mines of Brazil and the other plant-based plantations as well. The numbers grew and grew and grew, with more slaves being brought in the 18th century than in the total for all the others. The late 18th century saw voices of opposition picking up, with some of the earliest voices coming from English Quakers, but nonetheless, slavery entered the 19th century a very strong institution in the Americas, but not for long. Over the coming century, it was forced out of existence, and the transatlantic slave trade, the single largest forced migration of human beings ever conducted, came to an end. The United States banned the importation of slaves in 1807, though it would take until 1865 for slavery itself to be abolished there, and the very last slave shipment to land in the Americas landed in 1870 to Cuba, and Brazil closes the story of formal slavery in the Americas with their 1888 ending of slavery, and with that, the last and largest bastion of slavery in the Americas came to an end. For over 300 years, African slaves were traded across the Atlantic to the Americas. So many Africans were brought over that up until 1800, for every European who came to the Americas, 4 Africans were brought in chains. Overwhelmingly, they were brought to the Carribean Basin and Brazil. The Caribbean Basin saw around 50 to 55% of all the slaves brought over, and Brazil checked in at about 30 to 33% of the total. Next came the British colonies that would and did become the United States, which brought in 6% of the total, overwhelmingly in the American South. While slaves consisted of men and women and young and old alike, most slaves captured and brought over were men of prime physical labor age, about 15 to 35 years old. And while different slaves did different things, some filling domestic roles or more rarely being artisans of different sorts, overwhelmingly, slaves were not brought over for such purposes. Instead, they were transplanted for the purpose of working on plantations, and in the case of Brazil, a lot worked on gold mines as well after their 1700 discovery. Initially, the crop the plantations fancied was sugar. Brazil saw their first sugar plantation in 1518, and the 1560s and 70s saw a rise in sugar plantations, increasing the slave trade, though more areas and types of plantations would come, and the slave trade would correspondingly increase as well. The 17th century saw the rise of the Carribean Basin sugar plantations. Across time, different crops were introduced as successful plantation crops, namely tobacco, coffee, and cotton, and notice that 3 of those 4 are drugs of sorts. Specifically tobacco and coffee, while sugar is more of an in-betweener, providing calories as it does, but then again so does beer. And those same 3 are very clearly luxuries, not necessities. Of course, to the planters and traders, the point wasn't the given product, however, it was that they could make a profit off it. Profit they did, as a significant chunk of the most able-bodied Africans were lifted to do the work of their masters in the Americas. As for why Africans became the plantation workforce and the slave population more broadly, I'll report my synopsis of Professor Kenneth Vickery's take in his great courses, History of Africa. Kenneth Vickery argues that the answer lies along a couple of paths, cultural and practical. Culturally, Europeans were predisposed against the Africans on the basis of color, but far less than what would come. And also, it seems that religious differences were held in higher esteem initially, but receded in relative importance as the racist ideologies developed and coalesced more formally into being across time. Nonetheless, racial, cultural, and religious prejudices existed toward the Native Americans as well. And either way, enslaving white people was not anathema. So why go the route of Africans? Native Americans had been decimated by the diseases wrought upon them by European contact. And in fact, the enslavement of natives did occur. But while the indigenous were around in much smaller numbers than before, the whites were impractical, as often legal protections would get in the way, and the prejudice of Christianity could not be invoked or believed in, as they too were Christians. Two other aspects raised by Vickery are, one, the natives would be comfortable in the land and therefore much more capable of escaping, and two, the longitudinal difference between Europe versus Brazil and the Caribbean brought health costs as well that wouldn't be had when using longitudinally similar or even equivalent transfers of humans.